working in Western Maryland group. My co-worker back there with the books, Elizabeth. Hi, Elizabeth. This is our final Macomb lecture for the spring 2025 season. I'm lining up, or hoping to line up, speakers for the fall. For the fall, this fall and all of next year. So if you have any ideas, please let me know, because it seems like we've hit a lot of really good topics in the past, and we may have to start over. These lectures have been going on for a long time, and I haven't arranged too many of them, but I'm very pleased to have our speaker here tonight. Richard Smith has come down from Boston to regale us with information on a person whose name I was not familiar with. Now I've read up on this individual, and I feel like I know a lot more. Richard Smith has lectured on and written about antebellum United States history and 19th century American literature since 1995. He came down from Boston, as I mentioned, and has had a long sort of second career there as a historian and volunteer. He'll tell you a little bit more about that. And history-related organizations. And I sort of wish he lived close to us so we could have more of him. But for tonight, we will enjoy his lecture on Thomas Wentworth Higginson and all the many people he knew in his long life. So let us have Richard now, and I'll put it on you.
Thank you so much for having me here this evening. My name is Richard Smith. I'm a public historian actually in Concord, Massachusetts, which is about 18 miles west of Boston. Famous for a few things. It's where the American Revolution began 250 years ago last month on April 19th, 1775. And by the middle of the 19th century, we had a whole gaggle of writers: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Louise May Alcott, Nathaniel Hawthorne. They all lived in Concord. They're all still in Concord, over at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. We have a Sleepy Hollow in Concord as well. I would first like to thank the library for having me come down here to speak. Came down a few days early, spent a few days in Washington, D.C., went out to Harpers Ferry this afternoon, went to Frederick yesterday, the wonderful Civil War Museum there. So it's been kind of a working vacation, which has been kind of nice. So, and before I begin, how many of you have heard of Thomas Wentworth Higginson? Well, by the end of tonight, you'll all know who he is. Okay. So let's get started. The 19th century saw few people as radical as Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Throughout his long life, he was born in 1823, he died in 1911. He was a Unitarian minister, a writer, a transcendentalist, a feminist, an editor, and a radical abolitionist. He served the First Religious Society in Newburyport, Massachusetts, until they dismissed him for being too much of an abolitionist. He helped convene the Worcester Women's Rights Convention in 1850 and ran that same year for Congress on the Free Soil ticket. He was involved with two famous fugitive slave cases in Massachusetts, Thomas Sims in 1851 and Anthony Burns in 1854, and he was one of the so-called Secret Six who helped raise money for John Brown's attack on Harpers Ferry in 1859. He led an all-black regiment of freed slaves in the Civil War, and he worked to integrate the Newbury, Rhode Island public schools after the war. A prolific writer and world traveler, he traveled the world 10 times. He was a regular contributor to the Atlantic Monthly and other magazines for 30 years, writing some 500 essays on women's rights, anti-slavery, temperance, education reform, and other progressive issues, while writing and editing 35 books about history, nature, and literature. Higginson seemed to know everyone worth knowing, from reformers to literary stars to politicians, from Lucy Stone to Charles Sumner to Charles Darwin to Mark Twain. A friend and contemporary of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, today he's best remembered as the man who discovered Emily Dickinson, He would write later in his life, quote, "Few of us now remain who were baptized into the light and hope of the transcendental movement. To that and to the anti-slavery movement, I always feel that I owe most of what makes life worth living." Just some of the folks that he was very well acquainted with. Up on the left, the poet John Greenleaf Whittier. They were very close. He was well connected with Harriet Beecher Stowe there in the middle. In later years, he went to England and he visited Darwin twice. There's a great story of Darwin's daughter reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland while Higginson was there, and Darwin just laughing so hard he almost fell on the floor. Lucy Stone, the abolitionist and feminist, Frederick Douglass, they worked together in Boston. Henry David Thoreau, who he was particularly close with when he would visit Concord, and Mark Twain. You know, some of the leading intellectuals and reformers of the day. Higginson knew all of these folks. He lived well into the 20th century, dying at the age of 87 on May 11th, 1911. Born into a world not much different from the one his grandfather experienced in the 18th century, by the time Wentworth passed, he'd seen steamships, railroads, and telegraph invented, and a few years before his death, he saw the city of Boston switching over from gas to electric lighting. Two things that Thoreau never did was Higginson used a typewriter and he rode in an automobile. This evening, I'd like to introduce you to the militant and courageous Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a cosmopolitan man, if there ever was one. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts on December 22nd, 1823, the youngest of 10 children. His childhood, it was reported, was privileged and comfortable, but by the time he was 10, when his father died, the family had hit on hard times, and his mother, Louisa, was left to raise Wentworth and his siblings on her own. He and his mother would remain very close until her death in 1864. In later years, he would remember his mother as the one person who influenced him the most throughout his life. Just before 6 a.m. on August 26, 1837, young Wentworth, as he was called by his friends and family, arrived at the Harvard College University Hall. Over the next 2 days, he and other college hopefuls would take the entrance exams to see if they would become Harvard freshmen. Higginson, like most of the boys who were taking the exam, was young. He was 13, about to turn 14 a couple months later. He would be admitted, and he would be a good student, but to save money, he lived at home with his mother in Cambridge rather than live in the dorms. This made it hard for him to make friends with his classmates. He did become friends with his Greek tutor, Jones Very, a man who would soon be deemed insane because of his transcendental poetry. His Latin tutor was the Harvard professor of modern languages, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Higginson was a conscientious student, and he rose at 5 a.m. every day to drill himself in Greek, Latin, mathematics, and history. He finished eighth in his class freshman year, and in the class of 1841, he graduated second out of 45 boys. Although he liked learning, he was not fond of another Harvard requirement, attending chapel. In fact, he became notorious for always falling asleep during services. And he felt no shame about it. In his journal, he would write one Sunday afternoon that he snoozed through it all quite comfortably. Still, this disinterest in church services did not mean that Higginson was irreligious. After his graduation in 1841, he went on to attend the Harvard Divinity School, where he would be ordained in 1844. Now, Harvard Divinity was ground zero for the Unitarian Church, and all of the leaders of that church were Harvard graduates. But by the mid-1830s, some of the Unitarian ministry had become unhappy and dissatisfied with what they saw as a sedate church mired down by Christian dogma and outdated tradition. This dissatisfaction gave rise to a more liberal, independent-minded Unitarian clergy, and ministers like William Ellery Channing, James Freeman Clark, Theodore Parker, and Ralph Waldo Emerson were soon being called a new name to describe their mystical, progressive spirituality, transcendentalists. Up there we have Ralph Waldo Emerson on the left, Theodore Parker in the middle, James Freeman Clarke on the right. The 21-year-old Higginson quickly fell under the spell of transcendentalism. In fact, it was his reading of Emerson that directly led to his decision to join the ministry. On September 15, 1847, Higginson was ordained as the minister of the First Religious Society of Newburyport, Massachusetts. That's Higginson in 1847. On the left is his first church in Newburyport, and on the right is his church in Worcester, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, while the First Religious Society was a Unitarian church, it was far from radical. In fact, many of the members were quite concerned about Higginson's ordination because he openly espoused the teachings of Theodore Parker, and like Parker, Higginson was not only a transcendentalist, he was also an abolitionist, so the church was a little bit wary of him. Still, they'd been without a minister for some time, and they desperately needed one, so even a radical one like Higginson had to do. The next day, the Newburyport Herald would report on the new minister saying, quote, "Mr. Higginson is a young man of much intellectual and moral power. He seems tinctured with those radical and imaginative notions which would fain seek to govern society at large more wisely than God has seen fit to guide it ever since the dawn of creation." In other words, he's a transcendentalist. We've got to look out for this guy. Higginson would last barely 3 years at the church. In the end, he was indeed too abolitionist for the Newburyport community. One of the congregation would later say that Higginson was, quote, "too much of a reformer. This has always been a very pro-slavery society, and it was always strange to me how a man so strongly imbued with anti-slavery sentiments and others of a similar kind should be permitted to settle here at all." In 1852, Higginson would become pastor of the more radical and welcoming Free Church of Worcester, Massachusetts. He would hold that position until 1858. And from the very beginning of his career, it was evident that he was going to model his ministry on those of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker. Over time, he would become close friends with both of them. And it's safe to say that in a very literary sense, Emerson was the biggest influence on Higginson's writing. He considered Emerson to be the man of letters, the most influential writer of the era. The two men would socialize when Emerson lectured in Worcester, or when Higginson would lecture in Concord, he would stay at Emerson's house. This is a picture of Emerson's house in Concord. That is his study with all of the original furnishings, which are now in the Concord Museum. As a radical minister in a liberal Christian church, Higginson began to shine. His new church had no problems with his preaching. Worcester, Massachusetts was at the time a very progressive city, and many abolitionists lived there, and it was a vital part of the Underground Railroad. As a minister, Higginson felt it was his duty to speak out against the greatest sin of his era, slavery. He used his pulpit to spread the abolitionist message, yet he was not afraid to be actively involved in the fight against slavery. He felt that preaching wasn't really enough. He was a member of the Boston Vigilance Committee and personally led attacks to free jailed runaway slaves. So even in Massachusetts, we had a lot of abolitionists in Boston, Concord, Cambridge, Worcester, but Massachusetts would not necessarily have considered itself an abolitionist state. And so the Underground Railroad, much like the other states that it was involved in, was very hush-hush. And a lot of the ministers and most of the churches in Massachusetts really refused to speak out against slavery. They felt that it really wasn't their place to speak out on an issue that had to do with earthbound things going on like that. They felt it was more important to talk about how to get to heaven. So Emerson, Higginson, Parker, preaching anti-slavery all the time really got them into trouble with the Unitarian hierarchy in Boston. So the Vigilance Committee was a group of black and white people, mostly men, but some women in Boston. After the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, they would literally patrol the streets of Boston at night looking for people who might be slave catchers. And if they saw people who they thought might be slave catchers, they would immediately start to warn the African American population of Boston that there were slave catchers in the city. These are just two flyers that were around Boston in the early 1850s. This is Anthony Burns. On May 24th, 1854, Anthony Burns, a young African-American man, was arrested on his way home from work. He had escaped from slavery in Virginia and was working in Boston, where he was employed in a men's clothing store. Burns' enslaver, a man named Charles Suttle, had tracked him down and had him arrested by federal marshals. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the United States Constitution, Burns had no rights whatsoever, while Suttle could claim Burns as his property and have him returned to Virginia. Word of Burns' arrest spread quickly throughout Boston. Handbills announcing the kidnappers are here appeared all over the city. Anti-slavery proponents hastily dispatched letters seeking support from abolitionists in other towns. The pioneering black lawyer Robert Morris and the white lawyer Richard Henry Dana, both active members of the Boston Vigilance Committee, volunteered to defend Burns in court. Now, under the fugitive slave law, black men and women were not allowed to speak on their own behalf. They had to get somebody to do it for them. On May 26, 2 days after Burns' arrest, a crowd of some 5,000 people, most of them white, gathered at Faneuil Hall to protest Burns' incarceration. A smaller group, mostly black men and women, met at the Tremont Temple. And while the Faneuil Hall group debated strategy, those meeting at the church decided to act. They would march to the courthouse and free Burns by force. I'm sorry, that's a picture of the old courthouse. A small group of black men led by Thomas Wentworth Higginson stormed the courthouse and used a huge beam to create an opening in the front doors as a battering ram. A shot rang out as half a dozen sheriff's deputies beat back two men who attempted to enter the building. In the melee, Deputy U.S. Marshal James Batchelder was fatally stabbed, while Higginson himself narrowly avoided getting shot. As it was, he received a saber cut on his chin, from which he proudly carried the scar the rest of his life. As the attacking crowd began to flee the violence, Higginson yelled with blood streaming from his face, "You cowards, will you desert us now?" Only one man was brave enough to come forward and join Higginson. That was Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott. As the crowd silently watched, he slowly and deliberately walked across the courtyard and up the steps of the courthouse all by himself. He turned and asked the crowd, "Why are we not within?" Higginson replied, "Because these people will not stand by us." Another shot rang out, and finally both men realized that the rescue could not go on. They withdrew, bitter and angry. Burns remained in custody and would be returned to his enslaver in Virginia a few days later. That's a picture of Burns being led away down to the Boston docks, surrounded by militia and U.S. Marines sent by President Pierce. Then, of course, Higginson spoke out on it. He gave a sermon a few weeks later called Massachusetts in Mourning, talking about how a man was taken from the so-called cradle of liberty, seeking freedom and returned to slavery. In August 1856, Higginson was made an agent of the Massachusetts State Kansas Aid Committee, an organization devoted to getting Kansas admitted to the Union as a free state. Higginson's job was to help organize and transport abolitionist immigrants to the territory. And in October 1856, he himself went to Bleeding, Kansas with a band of free state settlers to see firsthand the continuing war with the pro-slavery border ruffians. Despite the frequent violence throughout the territory, Higginson and his group managed to avoid getting into any trouble. He would report on the state of affairs in Kansas with a series of letters that were published in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, titled A Ride Through Kansas, and he would sign these letters Worcester. He would write, "I know you enjoy going to Kansas, for it is as genuine a sensation as we expect it to be. Things and people are very real there. It is precisely like waking up some morning and stepping out on the Battle of Bunker Hill. One learns in a single day more about Greeks and Romans and English Puritans and Scotch Jacobites and Hungarians and all heroic peoples than any course of history can teach. What struck me most was the unconscious buoyancy of the people. Living in the midst of danger, they recognize it as the normal condition of existence, and they talk of it in the sort of way that sailors do. In the intervals of dinner, they talk over the last fight as if it were a picnic. And the patience is about as remarkable as the courage." So that's a picture of a Free State artillery group. Over on the far right, the guy with a nice little tam on, that is Owen Brown, one of John Brown's sons. And in fact, one of the people that was in Kansas in the mid-1850s was John Brown. These are more Free State fighters. And here's probably the most famous Free State fighter at the time. Now, in March of 1857, John Brown was in Boston and meeting with local abolitionists and lecturing on his anti-slavery activities in the Kansas Territory. His goal was to raise $25,000 and gather 200 Sharps rifles in order to free Kansas from the clutches of pro-slavery forces that had flooded into the territory in the hopes of making it a slave state. Brown had come east at the request of Frank Sanborn, a Concord schoolmaster and a friend of Emerson and Thoreau, and he was also the secretary of the Massachusetts Free Soil Association. Sanborn began to introduce Brown to the abolitionists of Boston, including William Lloyd Garrison, Theodore Parker, and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Now, some abolitionists, like Garrison, were dedicated pacifists, and they had qualms about Brown's guerrilla activities in Kansas. But Higginson had no reservations with Brown fighting pro-slavery fire with fire. He'd been to Kansas, and he saw firsthand the bloody struggles going on there. In fact, of all the abolitionists that Brown met in Massachusetts, Higginson was unabashedly the most extreme of them all, and as you saw in Boston, he loved a good fight, especially if there was a righteous cause attached to it. And even at this early stage, there were rumors afoot that Brown was a madman, or at the very least, slightly unhinged. But the Massachusetts abolitionists saw none of this in Brown. Higginson would later write of his first meeting with him in 1857, quote, "I saw before me a man whose mere appearance and bearing refuted in advance some of the strange perversions which have often wholly missed the type to which he belonged. In his thin, worn, resolute face, there were the signs of fire. His talk was calm, persuasive, and coherent." Higginson had long given up the idea that only passive resistance would end slavery, if indeed he ever believed it in the first place. In his radicalism, Higginson had been openly and publicly calling for disunion. In fact, in January of 1857, he was involved with the Disunion Convention in Worcester, and he had no issue with being called a fanatic or a traitor. "I am always ready to invest in treason," he would write to Brown. Like Brown, he'd come to believe that more drastic measures were needed to fight the growing power of the slaveocracy. And now, meeting with Brown in 1857, Wentworth Higginson had started down the long road that would forever connect his name with John Brown. With him were 5 other men who would soon become known as the Secret Six. So Brown met with the Secret Six several times over the course of 1858 and 1859 to discuss how he would attack the slave system. So that's the no longer there American Hotel in Boston, where Brown would always stay. The Secret Six, that's Frank Sanborn, George Luther Stearns, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Gerrit Smith, Samuel Gridley Howe, and Theodore Parker. So we have 2 ministers, a school teacher, and 3 philanthropists. Most of the money came from the 3 philanthropists. The ministers and the schoolmaster didn't have much money. Now, when he was in Boston and Concord in 1857, 1858, and 59, whether or not Harpers Ferry was openly discussed as a target is not really known, but it was later reported by Sanborn that he had some inkling that Brown would not confine his warfare to Kansas. Most of the 6, if not all, were under the assumption that Brown intended to go into Virginia to free the slaves. Violence may or may not have been in the plan, and regardless, Brown and his followers would take the slaves and go into the mountains, possibly the Alleghenies or the Adirondacks, and set up a series of fortresses. If this failed, they would then take them to Canada and freedom. And throughout 1858 and 59, the Secret Six continued to channel money and weapons to Brown. And by the time of the raid on Harpers Ferry, they'd given Brown at least $2,000, and he'd collected 200 Sharps rifles and 1,000 pikes. I'm sure you've all been there. Yes. I was just there this morning. On October 16, 1859, John Brown attacked the Federal Armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He and his band of 21 men, which Brown dubbed the Provincial Army, planned to seize some of the 100,000 muskets and rifles stored there in order to arm the enslaved people in Virginia and hopefully get them to safety or start a statewide slave rebellion. Initially, the raid went well for Brown and his men. They captured the armory. It was guarded by a single watchman, and they even took hostages, including Lewis Washington, a great-grandnephew of George Washington. But soon, local farmers, shopkeepers, and militia, alerted to the attack, pinned down the raiders by firing at them from around the town. Sporadic gunfire led to the deaths of locals being shot by Brown's men, including the mayor of Harpers Ferry, and some of Brown's men were also killed. A company of militia seized the railroad bridge into Harpers Ferry, blocking Brown's only escape route out of town. Brown and his remaining men then moved some of the prisoners into the fire engine house, a small brick building at the entrance to the armory. He had the doors and windows barred, and loopholes were knocked out of the bricks so that they could fire through the walls. The surrounding militia forces besieged the engine house and continually shot at the building. The raiders, trapped and surrounded, fired back from time to time. The siege would go on for 2 days. On the morning of October 18th, a company of U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee of the United States Army arrived at the ferry and prepared to attack the engine house. Colonel Lee sent a young Army Lieutenant, James Ewell Brown Stewart, under a white flag and to inform the raiders that their lives would be spared if they surrendered. Brown refused, saying, "No, I prefer to die here." Stewart then gave a signal and the Marines attacked. They used sledgehammers and a makeshift battering ram to break down the engine room door. Private Luke Quinn was shot as the Marines broke through the doors. Lieutenant Israel Green cornered John Brown and struck him several times with a saber, severely wounding him. The fight was over in less than 5 minutes. Brown and the surviving raiders were taken prisoner. Altogether, Brown's men killed 4 people and wounded 9. 10 of Brown's men were killed, including his sons Watson and Oliver. 5 of the raiders escaped, including Brown's son Owen, while 7 others were captured along with Brown. Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart in the years before the war. Inside the engine house, with John Brown looking very determined with his Sharps rifle. I like how all of the prisoners are just standing by with their hands in their pockets. More pictures drawn about the inside of the house. Letters and documents between Brown and the Secret Six were found in Brown's possession when he was captured at Harpers Ferry. and for their part, the six reacted in a surprising way. With the exception of Thomas Wentworth Higginson, they either denied their connection with Brown or they fled the country. Higginson neither denied his involvement with Brown, nor did he decide to run. Rather, he stayed home in Worcester, Massachusetts, almost daring federal marshals to come and get him. He refused to run to Canada, nor did he deny his involvement with Brown when asked. His support never wavered, and in some ways he felt almost guilty that he hadn't been at Harpers Ferry with Brown, and he said so publicly. My first feeling was one of remorse, that the men who had given him money and arms should not actually have been by his side. Higginson even formed a plan to rescue Brown and the other captive raiders before they went on trial. He was going to get a force of abolitionists, come to Virginia, capture Virginia Governor Wise, and hold him hostage in exchange for Brown. However, this plan never happened because they simply did not have the money for it. So Higginson stayed in Worcester, expecting federal marshals to come for him at any time, and much to his disappointment, they never arrived. Almost 50 years after John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry, Higginson would look back on the event and his involvement with Brown. What we did. In the end, we were trying to do right. And I believe in the greatest measure, we did do right. The result of the attack at Harpers Ferry, the hastening of inevitable disunion with civil war, was good, healthy, and positive. My one perennial wish, however, is that we would have achieved that end without the sacrifice of Brown. I persist in the belief that I at least could and should have realized the need to protect John Brown from himself. I should have recognized how incapable he was. I should have perceived the madness that dwelled within him, the insanity that sat stealthily beside his great, selfless nobility. A counter-proposal to Harpers Ferry should have been made something that would have protected Brown. In retrospect, I think the bombing of a few fine Southern buildings or a few famous Southern men with notes crediting the blast to some choice Northern abolitionist group would have done the job. Such action would have brought disunion quickly and without risk to anyone from our side. The Russian revolutionaries who were so efficient in making tyrant Tsar Alexander explode have much to teach us about practical terror. This is a minister speaking. With the start of the Civil War in 1861, Higginson was determined to do his part. He was originally a captain in the 51st Massachusetts Infantry, but as a well-known and respected abolitionist, he was contacted in late 1862 by Brigadier General Rufus Saxton and asked to take command of the 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry. The letter read, quote, "My dear sir, I am organizing the 1st Regiment of South Carolina Volunteers with every prospect of success. Your name has been spoken of in connection with the command of this regiment by some friends in whose judgment I have confidence. I take great pleasure in offering you the position of colonel in it and hope that you may be induced to accept. I shall not fill the place until I hear from you, or sufficient time has passed for me to receive your reply. Should you accept, I enclose a pass for Port Royal, South Carolina, of which I trust you will feel disposed to avail yourself at once." Higginson would later remember his reaction to the letter, quote, "Had an invitation reached me to take command of a regiment of Tartars, it would hardly have been more unexpected. I had always looked for the arming of the blacks and had always felt a wish to be associated with them. But the prevalent tone of public sentiment was still opposed to any such attempts. The government kept very shy of the experiment, and it did not seem possible that the time had come when it could be fairly tried." That's General Saxton. Those are men of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Higginson served as colonel of the regiment from November 1862 until October 1864, when he was wounded and honorably discharged from service. The creation and service of this regiment predated the creation of the better-known 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry by a few months. And while it's true that this regiment did not participate in any big battles, Higginson and his men did their part in several skirmishes and raids near Beaufort, South Carolina, and into Northeast Florida. In short, Higginson's regiment proved that black men could and would fight as well as white soldiers. Now, this talk could easily be twice as long as it's going to be if I went into a lot of detail about the regiment. But there's one story that always gets to me that I want to tell you. So first, they got red trousers originally from the federal government because they wanted this new black regiment to stand out from all the other regiments. Higginson and the soldiers hated the red trousers because they didn't want to stand out. They wanted to be treated equal with all of the other regiments. That's Camp Saxton down near Beaufort, South Carolina. A really great photograph of men of the 1st South Carolina Infantry in Beaufort, and a great picture of Colonel Higginson. After he left the service, the 1st South Carolina was redesignated as the 33rd Colored Infantry. Higginson in uniform, an actual picture of men from the 1st South Carolina, and then a great painting by Don Triani. He did meet Colonel Robert Gould Shaw once when the 54th Massachusetts went down to the Beaufort area. Shaw and Higginson had lunch together. And they were both really curious about how their men would act. So Shaw's men were all mostly free black men from the North. Higginson's men were all formerly enslaved, barely literate men. And they were kind of comparing notes to see how they would stand up against each other. But they both really liked each other a lot. Higginson knew Shaw from a very early age and was very good friends with Shaw's parents. And so this is the story I'm going to tell you about Emancipation Day. On January 1st, 1863, a New Year's Day celebration was held for the newly organized 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry at Port Republic, South Carolina. During the ceremony, some 3,000 civilians gathered to see the regiment receive their silk battle flags. The Emancipation Proclamation, which had taken effect at midnight, was stirringly read aloud to the throng, followed by speeches from local dignitaries, as well as a speech by Colonel Higginson. It was after Higginson's speech that something extraordinary happened. This is from Higginson. Then followed an incident so simple, so touching, so utterly unexpected and startling that I can scarcely believe it on recalling, although it gave the keynote to the whole day. The very moment the speaker had ceased, and just as I took and waved the flag, which now for the first time meant anything to these poor people, there suddenly arose, close behind the platform, a strong male voice, but rather cracked and elderly, into which two women's voices instantly blended, singing as if by impulse that could be no more repressed than the morning note of the song sparrow. They started singing, "My country, 'tis of thee." People looked at each other and then at us on the platform to see whence came this interruption, not set down in the bills. Firmly and irrepressibly, the quavering voices sang on, verse after verse. Others of the colored people joined in. Some whites on the platform began, but I motioned them to silence. I never saw anything so electric. It made all other words cheap. It seemed the choked voice of a race at last unleashed. Just think of it. The first day they had ever had a country. The first flag they had ever seen which promised anything to these people. And here, while mere spectators stood in silence, waiting for my stupid words, these simple souls burst out in their lay, as if they were by their own hearths at home. When they stopped, there was nothing to do but to speak, and I went on. But the life of the whole day was in some unknown people's song. The ceremony ended with a picnic for the 700 soldiers and invited guests. 10 steer had been butchered and roasted on spits. It had been a perfect day to usher in 1863. With the new year came emancipation. As Higginson would write, "Our festival has come and gone with great success, and our good general has been altogether satisfied." Another great photograph of the men of the 1st South Carolina. Some of the people that served in the unit. Up on the right was a nurse who actually wrote a book about her experiences being in the Civil War, and the dedication is to Higginson, and he wrote the introduction. In 1862, Higginson was approached by an unknown poet living in Amherst, Massachusetts, named Emily Dickinson, who sent him her poetry to see if Higginson thought it, quote, was alive. He did, and the two became frequent correspondents over the next 24 years, but they only met twice. Higginson also spoke at her funeral and was instrumental in getting her poetry published after her death. She was virtually unknown when she died, and she had some 1,800 poems that she had written, and he made sure that they got published about 6 years after her death. A letter to Colonel Higginson in Emily's handwriting. He was living in Newport at the time. After the war, for the rest of his life, he continued to be called Colonel Higginson. That's Emily when she was quite younger. She was in her mid-30s when she wrote to him for the first time. That's a picture of her, as far as we know, the only picture of her when she was 16. After the Civil War, Higginson continued to fight for reform and became involved in the women's rights movement. He helped found the American Women's Suffrage Association, and starting in 1877, he was the editor of their magazine, the Woman's Journal, for the next 14 years. He also advocated for equal access to education for women and for equal pay for equal work, especially for teachers. He was very close with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony. In 1893, Higginson became one of the founders of the Free Religious Association. One lecture for them, which was later republished for the World Parliament of Religions Conference at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, was called The Sympathy of Religions. Written in 1855, Higginson wrote, "The human soul, like any other noble vessel, was built not to be anchored, but to sail. Every year brings new knowledge of the religions of the world, and every step in knowledge brings out sympathy between them." Basically, as a ministry, he believed that all religions were the same. And at this Council on Religion in 1893, Swami Vivekananda, he brought Hinduism to America for the very first time. And he and Higginson got along very well. In 1905, along with Upton Sinclair, Jack London, and W.E.B. Du Bois, Higginson was involved with the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. The organization's aim was to educate the young people of America by throwing, quote, "a light on the worldwide movement of industrial democracy known as socialism." The ISS sponsored lecture tours, magazines, seminars, and discussion circles all over the U.S., mostly at colleges, to propagate socialist ideas among America's collegiate population. W.E.B. Du Bois's membership card. Higginson in later years, that's him with his daughter Margaret. He was the first person in Cambridge to have a tricycle, and he and she would ride around Cambridge on it all the time. He also traveled to Europe a bunch of times. He went to the Azores. As I said, he met Darwin a couple of times. Went to Japan. Some of his better known writings, including the Atlantic Monthly, which he wrote for about 30 years. Army Life in a Black Regiment. Have any of you read that book? It's great. It gives a really great detailed account of his life with a black regiment, basically one of the first black regiments of the war. The first colored Kansas regiment was a couple of months before the 1st South Carolina, which was a couple of months before the 54th Massachusetts. His book, Cheerful Yesterdays, is basically about his life in the abolitionist world and the transcendental world. And he also wrote the first biography of Margaret Fuller, the feminist. So these are some of his writings. That's his house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he lived the last 15 years of his life. A picture of him in his study. That's me at his grave. Thomas Wentworth Higginson died in Cambridge on May 9th, 1911. He was 87 years old. While he had been many things throughout his life, he was most proud of his service in the Civil War. And he would write in 1869, "No doubt there were reasons why this particular war was an especially favorable test of the colored soldier. They had more to fight for than the whites. Besides the flag and the Union, they had home and wife and child. They fought with ropes around their necks. And when orders were issued that the officers of colored troops should be put to death on capture, they took a grim satisfaction. It helped their esprit de corps immensely. With us, at least, there was to be no play soldiering. Although they had begun with a slight feeling of inferiority to the white troops, this compliment substituted a peculiar sense of self-respect. And even when the new colored regiments began to arrive from the north, my men still pointed out this difference, that in case of ultimate defeat, the northern troops, black or white, would go home, while the 1st South Carolina must fight it out or be re-enslaved. I used to seriously ponder during the darker periods of the war whether I might not end up my days as an outlaw." Thomas Wentworth Higginson was the last one of his era, an era that saw the likes of William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Lucy Stone, Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Frederick Douglass, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Charles Sumner. It was an era of political radicalism and literary excellence, and Higginson was in the midst of it all. Whether he was promoting great writers or himself writing thoughtful essays for The Atlantic, or fighting for abolition and women's rights from the pulpit or on the battlefield, he was a one-of-a-kind man in a one-of-a-kind era. He was truly a cosmopolitan man, and his whole life was truly a sermon on freedom. We will never see his like again. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Could we turn the lights off maybe? Yes, ma'am.
The books you showed, are they available on like Google Books or?
You can find them just about anywhere.
Okay.
Including like first editions and early editions. The good thing about Higginson not being as famous as like Thoreau or Emerson, his first editions are really cheap. And you can find them. I go to Abe Books, which is really good. Most of what I've gotten from him I get on Abe Books, also eBay. So
I'm an avid eBay shopper myself.
but his stuff is pretty easy to find. But I highly recommend, if you've never read Army Life in a Black Regiment, it's one of the better Civil War first-person accounts. Questions?
We do have that in the list of Maryland here, but you can't check it out. So you'll have to read a few chapters at a time.
Are there any questions? Oh, can YouTube take questions? Yes.
I have a question. Remember from earlier in your talk that Wentworth Higginson mentioned his mother was the greatest influence on him. What can you tell us about her?
She taught him a lot about duty, not only to God, but also to mankind. From what we understand, she was very loving. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of letters between the two of them. Even, she died in 1864, even once he joined the army. Besides his first wife, he wrote to his mother more than any other person. talking about what was going on with the war and with abolitionism and things like that. But the idea of duty and to yourself and to God and your country, he absolutely learned from her. And she really inspired him to live that life.
Did he remain a minister his whole life?
By 1858, when he left the church in Worcester, he pretty much started just becoming a lecturer and a writer. So he would still give sermons on occasion, but by 1858, I mean, he went to Kansas. He wasn't really around in Worcester that much. And so, like people like Emerson and Thoreau, he really started to make his living as a lecturer and a writer. And he was one of the more prolific and one of the more favorite authors of the Atlantic Monthly. He also wrote for Harpers Bazaar a lot after the Civil War. So he kind of became a man of letters. They always called him Reverend Higginson until the war. Then after that, for the rest of his life, he was Colonel Higginson. And a lot of people made a big deal of the fact that here's this minister now fighting with the black men for their freedom. And he was incredibly well known around the country, not too popular south of the Mason-Dixon line, as you can imagine. And him and Emerson and Thoreau, Theodore Parker, William Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, they were all kind of lumped together as this group of radical Bostonian abolitionists who were causing trouble by talking about slavery all the time. In fact, today's the day that Charles Sumner's caning took place in Washington, D.C. So this is for him, I guess. Yes.
I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
One, the Civil War was interesting. I learned about it. One of my favorite episodes is Bugs Bunny is in the Civil War. Two, I like the Mason-Dixon reference line. Secondly, you mentioned W.B. Du Bois, which was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. And also, I don't know if you can hear me. I don't want to be too boisterous, but I think W.B. Du Bois, because it's French sounding last name. I think he was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, Du Bois, yes.
And
Yes,
the Civil War was a big deal.
W.E.B. Du Bois.
Correct, and then or Du Bois. You know, that's
the way it's
a debate.
pronounced here.
That's a debate, right? And so,
Yeah.
how you articulate it. Then, secondly, one of my favorite quotes by Abraham Lincoln is, "Better to remain silent if you thought it was a fool than to speak out of all doubt." So I think this is spot on. It's good, not just for the lecture series, but for your own personal knowledge.
Thank you so much.
And the abolitionist, Frederick Douglass.
So my job the last couple of years as a historian is to make sure everybody knows about this guy. The problem is, the question always is, well, why is he as famous as Emerson or Thoreau?
The transcendentalist, right?
He was a really good writer. He wasn't a great writer. He was all over the map. He wrote about nature. He wrote about history. He wrote about reform. He met Emily Dickinson because he wrote an article for the Atlantic called "Letters to a Young Contributor," basically an article saying, "Hey, you want to get published? This is what you need to do." And Emily read that and said, "Oh, this guy might be the guy that I can send my poetry to." So he's a lot like other people from the period, like Margaret Fuller, who was such a household name, but now she's almost forgotten. He kind of gets lost in the shuffle underneath all the other insanely famous people that he knew. You know, he's hanging out with Longfellow and Whittier and Emerson and Sumner, and those are household names even today because they wrote brilliant poetry and brilliant literature. Wentworth's literature is good. It was good enough to be in the Atlantic. I certainly wouldn't put any of his books on the level of like Walden by Henry Thoreau or any of Emerson's essays. But it's good, and I like it because there's so much of it. And the fact that he lived so long, by the time he died in 1911, you know, a lot of the obituaries say, oh, he's from that other time. You know, the transcendental abolition slave times. You know, he was basically the last one of all of those people. So by the time he died, that was old timey. That was the old timey stuff. Yeah.
Do you have any information on what happened to the rest of the secret six, the other five?
Oh,
Some
sure.
of them are in Canada, some of them.
Yeah, we'll go back and look at them.
Does it talk about it?
Back in time. So Frank Sanborn, up on the left, he was a schoolmaster in Concord. Actually, federal marshals came to Concord in 1860 looking for him. And they wanted to tie him to the John Brown raid. But the people of Concord, they attacked the federal marshals and threw rocks and dirt at them and drove them out of town. They pulled the hair of the guys. They pulled the tail off the horse. I mean, so people of Concord stood up. He, in later years, he was involved with the Boston Institute of the Blind, as was Samuel Ridley Howe in the middle. The most famous person who graduated from that school was Andy Sullivan, who later, of course, was with Helen Keller. So Garrett Smith was a philanthropist. He claimed insanity and had himself put into an institute in upstate New York after they found letters to him to John Brown. Samuel Ridley Howe, he was married to a woman who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Julia Ward Howe. So she pretty much outshined him. So, and then on the bottom is Theodore Parker. He was suffering from tuberculosis. He went to Florence, Italy, and died there in 1860, and is buried there. But of all of them, the ones that were known as the most radical were definitely Higginson and Parker. Samuel Ridley Howe was also very much involved with the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the war. And John Brown, we don't have to name him. Yeah.
And there's two John Browns. There's this John Brown, and there's an African American man named John Brown. They're both abolitionists, but they happen coincidentally.
Right, I don't know that much about the African American.
An abolitionist like himself, just
right.
different, but basically fought for suffrage, fought for freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm assuming most of you have been to Harpers Ferry. How many of you have been to Charlestown to see the site where he was hanged? Yeah. So.
There's a great museum there. Were you able to go to the museum?
I'm sorry?
Were you able to go to the museum there?
I've been to the museum.
In Charleston?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, they got the wagon that he was taken to, and they got some of his pipes, yeah. Back in 2018, for the first 9 months of 2018, I actually moved to Harpers Ferry.
Oh, wow.
I left Concord for 9 months, and thought I was going to stay down here for a while. I gave one lecture when I was here, and it was on the Concord Transcendentalists. And so I couldn't really get away from these guys. So after 9 months, I went back to Concord, working at Gettysburg. But when I was living down here, I visited all the John Brown places and did a lot of research. Absolutely.
You could do worse than live in Concord.
I'm sorry?
I said you could do worse than live in Concord. Concord's pretty nice.
Yeah, Concord's kind of the center of the universe.
They think that is.
Okay, my universe. Yes.
Okay, one more question. What are you working on now?
So I write for Applewood Books / Arcadia Publishing. I've done 11 books for them, mostly quotation books. I started with quotations of Henry David Thoreau back in 2017. I've done quotations of John Muir, Barack Obama, Malcolm X. I did short biographies of Alexander Hamilton and John Muir. I'm currently working on quotations of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then my next one is going to be quotations of Ida B. Wells, the black feminist. And
Get some women in there.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Get some women on your list.
That's my goal. In fact, I was told by my editor that after I finish Ida B. Wells, I'll probably be doing something about Harriet Tubman. So, and I'm also doing a big book called Quotations of the Revolutionary Era, 1760 to 1790. And the first quote is going to be by King George III. The last quote is going to be by President George Washington from his first inaugural. And everything in between is going to be everybody that I can find involved with the American Revolution. Next year's the 250th, of course, although this year was our 250th in Concord. But everybody, loyalists, rebels, women, indigenous people, enslaved. I'm going to try to get everybody to get a complete picture of the Revolutionary Era from everybody that was alive at the time. So that's going to be my big book coming out next year.
We'll want a copy.
If you go to Arcadia Books, if you go to Arcadia Publishing
Yeah.
and put my name, you'll see, you can find all my books.
Okay.
Yeah. And I write for Discover Concord Magazine. I write historical articles for them, mostly Concord related stuff. But if you go to Discover Concord Magazine and put in my name, all of my articles come up. So I'm working on, I have 3 books due by the end of the year. And another lecture I'm giving next week. So, and I'm gallivanting around DC like I got nothing to do.
Go with that as long as it works.
It works. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure. I love coming down. This is my favorite part of the country. I love this part of Maryland. And thank you so much for having me come down. I really appreciate it.
Glad to have you.